The winter of 1945 was the coldest Berlin had seen in decades, but in the smaller towns, scattered across the eastern provinces of what had once been the Third Reich, the cold was not just a matter of temperature, it was hunger. It was the hollow silence of empty streets where children no longer played. It was the weight of defeat and the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. Before we journey into this forgotten moment of history, where enemies became something else, something unexpected, I want to invite you to join us here. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell because stories like this, the ones that slip through the cracks of textbooks, deserve to be remembered. Now let us go back to a small town in the eastern reaches of Germany, where the spring thaw of 1945 brought not just melting snow, but an encounter that would echo in the memories of children for the rest of their lives. The town had no name that mattered anymore. The sign at its entrance had been torn down weeks before, first by retreating Wehrmacht soldiers stripping metal for scrap, then by advancing Red Army troops who saw no need to preserve what had been. What remained were grey stone buildings with shattered windows, cobblestone streets cracked and littered with rubble, and a population that had shrunk by half. Some had fled west. Others had not survived the final months of the war. Those who remained moved like ghosts through the ruins, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow with a fatigue that went deeper than sleepless nights. They were hungry. Not the kind of hunger that comes from missing a meal, but the grinding, persistent hunger that turns skin translucent and makes bones ache. The kind that makes mothers weep silently when their children ask for food that does not exist. In early May, when the capitulation was signed and the guns finally fell silent, the town's remaining inhabitants numbered fewer than 800. Most were women, children, and the elderly. The men were gone, either dead on distant battlefields, imprisoned in camps, or simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing empire. The town had no functioning government, no police, no organized distribution of resources. There was only survival, day by day. Scavenged potato peels boiled into a thin broth, dandelion greens picked from between the ruins, the occasional crust of bread hoarded like treasure. And then, one morning in late May, when the sun finally broke through the perpetual grey that seemed to have settled over the land, they heard the sound of engines. The convoy rolled in slowly, 3 trucks painted in dull olive green, their tires crunching over debris. At the front was a covered vehicle that most of the townspeople did not recognize, a field kitchen, what the Soviets called a polevaya kuchnia. It was a mobile cooking unit mounted on wheels, with chimneys jutting from its roof and the smell of burning wood already wafting from within. Behind it came supply trucks, their beds covered with tarpaulins that concealed whatever provisions lay beneath. The soldiers who accompanied the convoy were young, most of them, their faces weathered by years of fighting, but still retaining a spark of something that had survived the brutality of the Eastern Front. They wore padded jackets despite the warming weather, and their rifles were slung casually over their shoulders, not held at the ready. They did not look like conquerors. They looked tired. The field kitchen came to a halt in the town square, or what had been the town square before the bombing. Now it was a clearing surrounded by the skeletal remains of buildings, a fountain that no longer worked, and a statue that had been toppled. The soldiers dismounted and began to set up with practiced efficiency. 2 of them unfolded metal legs to stabilize the kitchen, while others hauled out sacks of grain and crates of canned goods from the supply trucks. A sergeant, a man in his early 30s with a thick beard and calloused hands, supervised the operation. His name was Alexei Petrov, and he had been a cook before the war, in a small restaurant in Smolensk. He had cooked for soldiers for 4 years now, through the siege of Leningrad, across the endless plains of Ukraine, through the forests of Poland, and into Germany. He had seen more death than any man should, and he had learned that food, simple and warm, was sometimes the only thing that kept a human being tethered to the world. The townspeople began to emerge slowly. First, a few curious children, their faces pinched with hunger, their clothes patched and too large or too small depending on what their mothers had managed to salvage. Then came the women, wary and frightened, clutching shawls around their shoulders, their eyes flicking between the soldiers and the field kitchen with a mix of hope and terror. They had heard stories, whispered in the dark, about what happened when the Red Army arrived, but they had also heard that some units brought food, and food was all that mattered now. Alexei noticed them gathering at a distance and called out to one of his subordinates, a young private named Ivan who spoke a little German. Ivan stepped forward and raised his hands in a gesture meant to be reassuring. He said in halting, broken German that there would be soup, hot soup, and bread. for everyone. He pointed to the field kitchen, where smoke was now rising steadily from the chimney, and made a gesture of eating. The townspeople did not move at first. They stood frozen, uncertain, afraid that this was some kind of trick, that if they approached, they would be shot or arrested or worse. But then a child broke from the group, a little girl no more than 7, with tangled blonde hair and a dress that hung like a sack on her thin frame. She took a few hesitant steps toward the field kitchen, stopped, looked back at her mother, and then continued. Her name was Liesel. Alexei watched the girl approach and crouched down to her level. He smiled, a weary but genuine smile, and said something in Russian that she did not understand. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of dark bread, wrapped in a cloth. He held it out to her. Liesel stared at the bread, her eyes wide, and then at the soldier. She did not take it at first. Alexei waited, his hand steady, and finally Liesel reached out and took the bread. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it, and when she bit into it, tears began to stream down her face. She had not tasted bread in weeks. That small act broke the dam. Other children began to move forward, emboldened by Liesel's courage, and their mothers followed, still cautious but no longer paralyzed by fear. Within minutes, a line had formed in front of the field kitchen. Alexei stood and called to his men to begin serving. They ladled out thick soup, a mixture of barley, potatoes, and bits of cabbage, from enormous iron cauldrons that steamed in the cool morning air. Each person was given a tin cup or bowl, whatever they had brought or whatever the soldiers could provide, and a ladle full of the hot, nourishing liquid. The sound of the ladle scraping against the iron, the hiss of steam, the murmur of voices, all of it created a kind of symphony that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. Liesel's older brother, a boy of 10 named Kurt, stood beside her in the line. He was trying to be brave, to be the man of the house now that their father was gone, but his hands shook as he held out his mother's dented pot to receive the soup. When the soldier poured the steaming liquid into it, Kurt whispered, "Danke." The soldier, Ivan, nodded and said, "Pожалуйста," which Kurt did not understand, but the tone was clear. It was kindness. It was recognition of shared humanity. Kurt carried the pot carefully back to where his mother waited, and together they sat on the steps of a ruined building and ate. The soup was hot and rich, and filled their bellies in a way that nothing had for so long. Liesel looked up at her brother and said, "They saved us." Kurt nodded, too overcome to speak. The field kitchen became a fixture in the town over the following weeks. Every morning, the soldiers would fire up the stoves and prepare meals. Breakfast was usually a thin porridge made from grain and a little milk powder. Lunch was soup, always soup, thick with whatever vegetables and grains were available. Dinner was bread, and sometimes a bit of canned fish or meat, though supplies of meat were rare and precious. The townspeople came to rely on this routine, and slowly, as the days passed and no harm came to them, the fear began to ebb. They still did not trust the occupiers, not fully, but they trusted the food. They trusted that the soldiers would keep them alive. Alexei took a particular interest in the children. He had lost his own daughter in the siege of Leningrad, a little girl named Katya, who had been 5 years old when she died of starvation. He had not been there. He had been at the front fighting while his family slowly wasted away in the frozen city. The guilt of that loss haunted him every day, and so he poured his grief into feeding these German children, these former enemies, as if by saving them he might somehow atone for the one he could not save. He learned their names: Liesel, Kurt, a quiet boy named Hans, a pair of twins named Greta and Frida. He slipped them extra pieces of bread when he could, and once he gave Liesel a small wooden doll that one of his comrades had carved from a scrap of wood. She clutched it like a treasure. But the occupation was not without its tensions. There were Soviet officers who resented the idea of feeding Germans, who argued that these people were the enemy, that they had brought this suffering upon themselves. There were soldiers who had lost entire families to the German invasion, who had seen villages burned and women and children murdered, and who could not find it in their hearts to show compassion. And there were incidents, moments of violence and retribution that the townspeople tried not to speak of, that cast a shadow over the fragile peace. But in the town square, around the field kitchen, there was a kind of truce. The food was a neutral ground, a place where hunger trumped hatred, at least for a little while. As summer approached, supplies began to dwindle. The war was over, but the infrastructure of Europe was shattered. Roads were impassable, bridges were destroyed, and the logistical networks that had once fed armies were now struggling to feed civilians. Alexei and his unit received smaller and smaller shipments of provisions. The soup became thinner, the portions smaller. He had to implement rationing, issuing cards to the townspeople that entitled them to 1 meal per day. The children still came, but now there were arguments in the line, accusations of favoritism, fights over who had received more. Alexei did his best to keep order, but he felt the weight of it pressing down on him, the knowledge that he could not feed everyone, that soon there might not be enough. One evening in late June, when the sun hung low in the sky and the air was warm and heavy, Alexei received word that the next supply convoy would be delayed by at least a week. He stood in front of the field kitchen, staring at the nearly empty sacks of grain, the few remaining cans of vegetables, and he made a decision. He called his men together and told them that starting the next day they would share their own rations with the townspeople. The soldiers protested. They were hungry too. They had marched and fought and bled for years, and now they were being asked to give up their food for people who had been their enemies just weeks before. But Alexei was firm. He reminded them that they were soldiers, that they had strength and youth on their side, that they could endure hunger better than children and old women. He said, "We do this because it is the right thing to do, because if we do not, we are no better than the monsters we fought against." The next morning, when the townspeople arrived for their meal, they found the portions were slightly larger than they had been the day before. The soup was thicker, and there was an extra piece of bread for each child. They did not know that the soldiers had eaten only a thin gruel for their own breakfast, that they had given up their allocation of meat and fat and grain. They did not know that Alexei himself had not eaten at all, that he was running on nothing but black tea and willpower. But Liesl noticed that the soldier, the one with the beard who always smiled at her, looked thinner. She noticed that his hands shook a little when he ladled out her soup, and after she finished eating, she walked back to the field kitchen and tugged on his sleeve. When he looked down, she held out the wooden doll he had given her and said in her small, earnest voice, "For you, so you do not forget." Alexei took the doll, his eyes glistening, and knelt down to Liesl's level. He said in Russian, "I could never forget." Then, in broken German, "You are good child." Liesl hugged him, a quick, fierce embrace, and ran back to her mother. That evening, as the soldiers sat around their own meager dinner, Ivan asked Alexei why he kept the doll. Alexei turned it over in his hands, his thumb tracing the rough carvings, and said, "Because she reminded me that we are still human. That is worth more than bread." The days that followed were some of the hardest. The supply convoy arrived, but it brought less than expected. Alexei had to cut rations again, and this time he could not make up the difference from the soldiers' portions. There were days when the children went to bed hungry, when the soup was so thin it was little more than hot water with a few grains floating in it. Mothers wept in frustration, and some of the townspeople began to lose hope, to wonder if survival was even possible. But every morning, the field kitchen was there. Every morning, Alexei and his men prepared what little they had and distributed it fairly. And every morning the children came and they said, "Danke." They said, "Spasibo." They said, "They saved us first." It became a kind of mantra, a phrase repeated by the children to their mothers, to each other, to anyone who would listen. When someone complained about the Red Army, when there was anger or fear or resentment, the children would say, "But they saved us first. They gave us food when no one else did." It was not that they forgot the fear or the hardship. It was that they remembered the kindness. They remembered the soldier with the beard who smiled at them, who gave them extra bread, who treated them like they mattered. They remembered that when the world was at its darkest, when they were sure they would starve, someone had cared enough to feed them. By the time autumn arrived, the situation had stabilized somewhat. The Allies had established occupation zones, and relief organizations were beginning to bring in food and supplies. The field kitchen was no longer the only source of sustenance in the town, and Alexei's unit received orders to move on, to be deployed elsewhere in the vast territory that the Soviet Union now controlled. The townspeople gathered to see them off, a strange and bittersweet farewell. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, just a crowd of tired, thin people standing in the town square, watching as the soldiers packed up the field kitchen and loaded it onto the trucks. Liesl pushed her way to the front of the crowd and ran to Alexei. She held out the wooden doll again and said, "You give back. You need it more." Alexei shook his head and gently closed her fingers around the doll. He said, in his rough, accented German, "You keep, remember." Liesl nodded, tears streaming down her face, and said, "I remember. Always." Kurt stood beside his sister and saluted, a stiff, formal gesture that made Alexei smile despite himself. He saluted back, and then he climbed into the truck. As the convoy pulled away, the townspeople waved. Some of them were crying. Others simply stood in silence watching until the trucks disappeared down the ruined road. The years passed. The town rebuilt, slowly and painfully. New buildings rose where old ones had stood, roads were repaired, and life returned to a kind of normalcy. Liesel and Kurt grew up, went to school, found work, married, had children of their own, but they never forgot the spring of 1945, when they had been starving and soldiers from a country they had been taught to hate had fed them. They told the story to their children, and their children told it to their children, so that the memory would not be lost. Decades later, in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a journalist came to the town to write an article about the post-war period. He interviewed the elderly residents, and when he spoke to Liesel, now a grandmother with silver hair and kind eyes, she told him about Alexei. She told him about the field kitchen, about the soup and the bread, about the wooden doll she still kept in a box in her bedroom. The journalist asked if she had ever tried to find him, to thank him properly. Liesel said she had thought about it, but she did not know his last name, did not know if he had survived the years that followed. The journalist said he would try to help. It took months of searching, letters sent to archives in Moscow and Smolensk, interviews with veterans organizations. But eventually, they found a lead. Alexei Petrov had survived the war. He had returned to Smolensk, resumed his work as a cook, and lived quietly until his death in 1983. But he had left behind a son, Mikhail, who still lived in the city. The journalist arranged for Liesel and Mikhail to meet, and in the summer of 1992, Liesel traveled to Russia for the first time in her life. The meeting took place in a small park in Smolensk, near the restaurant where Alexei had worked before the war. Mikhail was in his 50s, a stocky man with his father's eyes and his father's hands, calloused and strong. He brought with him a photograph of Alexei in uniform, standing beside the field kitchen, and a journal that his father had kept during the war. When Liesel saw the photograph, she began to cry. She said, "That is him, that is the man who saved us." Mikhail opened the journal and showed her an entry from June 1945. It was written in Alexei's neat, careful handwriting, and it said, "Today I met a little girl who reminded me of Katya. She was hungry, and I gave her bread. I hope it was enough. I hope I am doing the right thing." Liesel and Mikhail spent the afternoon talking, sharing stories about Alexei, about the war, about the strange and terrible circumstances that had brought them together across decades and borders. Liesel gave Mikhail the wooden doll, and he held it as if it were made of glass. He said, "My father never spoke much about the war, but he told me once that the only thing that kept him sane was cooking for people, feeding them, keeping them alive. He said it was the only thing that made sense in a world that had gone mad." Liesel nodded and said, "He saved us first. When no one else would, we never forgot." In the years that followed, Liesel became an advocate for reconciliation between Germany and Russia. She spoke at schools and universities, telling the story of the field kitchen